A sharp knock echoed through my foyer, just as I was reviewing renovation plans for my newest apartment project. 3 knocks. Slow. Confident. I glanced at the security monitor, expecting a courier or one of my contractors. Instead, I forgot how to breathe. A man with graying hair stood beside a woman clutching a faded family photograph. My family photograph. The one taken just weeks before I disappeared from their lives. For 22 years, they had never called. Never written. Never searched for me. Now they were standing on my doorstep like they belonged there. I opened the door only a few inches. Harold Brooks smiled first. There you are. Elaine's eyes swept across the polished hardwood floors behind me before settling on my face. You've done well for yourself. Not hello. Not we're sorry. Not how have you been. Harold placed one hand against the door, as if he expected to walk inside. We're your parents, he said evenly. It's time you helped us. For a second, I saw not the wealthy neighborhood around me, but a frightened 10-year-old girl gripping one small suitcase, while those same 2 people refused to look back. Only now the child was gone. The woman standing before them owned the house they were trying to enter. I didn't move. Neither did they. And somehow they acted as though I was the one keeping a family apart. Elaine sighed dramatically. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I kept my hand on the doorknob. What do you want? We're family, she replied. Family takes care of each other. The words landed with almost unbelievable audacity. Family. The same people who had erased me from theirs were suddenly using that word like it had never left their mouths. Neither of them apologized. Neither asked whether I'd survived. Neither wondered what happened after they left me behind. Instead, Harold looked past my shoulder into the house. Beautiful place, he observed. The neighborhood's worth a fortune these days. A chill crept through me. That wasn't a lucky guess. He knew where I lived. He knew what this house was worth. He had done his homework, which meant this visit hadn't happened on impulse. It had been planned. As they stood on my porch pretending 22 years were nothing more than a long silence, memories I'd spent years locking away forced themselves back into the light. I was 10 years old again, standing in our tiny living room while my mother folded clothes into a battered blue suitcase. Only take what fits, she had said without looking at me. I thought we were moving. I asked where everyone else's bags were. No one answered. Later that afternoon, my father finally crouched in front of me. His voice was calm. Too calm. Every bad thing that's happened to this family started after you were born. I stared at him, waiting for him to smile. He never did. You bring bad luck. My mother nodded, as though he had simply stated the weather. The broken washing machine. My father's layoffs. Medical bills. Even my grandmother slipping on wet grass. Everything somehow became my fault. By sunset, I was sitting in the back seat of their car, holding my suitcase, while hoping they had changed their minds. Instead, they drove to a county office. A social worker greeted us. My parents signed papers. Then they walked away. They never looked back. Not once. Years passed without birthdays. Without Christmas cards. Without phone calls. Without anyone asking whether I was safe. And now, those same people were standing outside the home I had built from nothing. Harold folded his arms. His voice turned firm. You've become successful because we gave you life. He leaned closer. You owe us more than you could ever repay. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked from Harold to Elaine, searching their faces for even the smallest trace of regret. There was none. I stepped outside and quietly closed the front door behind me. If we're having this conversation, I said, it happens out here. Elaine frowned. You're really going to make your own parents stand on the porch? My parents made a 10-year-old stand alone a long time ago. The words hung between us. Neither of them responded. Instead, Harold cleared his throat, as though I'd interrupted the conversation he wanted to have. We've all made mistakes. Mistakes, I repeated. You were young. You wouldn't understand the pressure we were under. I folded my arms. I understood enough to know you drove away without me. Elaine shook her head impatiently. You always remembered things so dramatically. For a moment, I almost laughed. They weren't denying what happened. They were simply trying to rename it. Harold softened his voice. We did what any parents would have done. I stared at him. No. He continued anyway. We couldn't give you what you needed. You didn't even try. We sacrificed more than you'll ever know. The word sacrifice hit harder than I expected. Sacrifice meant giving something valuable away unwillingly. That wasn't what they'd done. They had chosen to remove me from their lives. The memory returned with painful clarity. Every time something went wrong in our house, my father's eyes found me first. If the electricity was shut off, if you weren't here, we'd have money. If my mother caught the flu, you've always brought trouble. When my father lost another job, you cursed this family from the day you were born. I had believed them. At 10 years old, I actually wondered whether people could carry bad luck inside them. I spent years apologizing for things that were never my fault. It took decades before I stopped introducing myself to the world like I needed permission to exist. Elaine interrupted my thoughts. We've forgiven the past. I blinked. You've forgiven me. Someone has to move forward. The absurdity of it almost stole my voice. She was speaking as though I had abandoned them, as though I had walked away. I looked at both of them more carefully. Neither asked where I'd lived after foster care. Neither asked whether anyone had adopted me. Neither asked if I'd gone to college. Neither knew whether I was married, whether I'd ever been sick, whether I'd been happy. They knew absolutely nothing about my life. Yet Harold casually nodded toward the company logo embroidered on my jacket. Brooks Restoration Group. He smiled. Quite an impressive business. Elaine added, property investments too, isn't it? I felt my stomach tighten. Those weren't details anyone guessed. Someone had told them exactly who I had become. Someone had even told them how I made my money. This wasn't an emotional reunion. It was a business proposal disguised as family. I took one slow step toward them. My office isn't listed under my home address. Neither answered. My house was purchased through a trust. Silence. My phone number isn't public. Harold suddenly became interested in the flower bed beside the walkway. Elaine adjusted the strap of her purse. Finally, I asked the question neither of them wanted to hear. Who told you where to find me? They exchanged a quick glance. Neither spoke. But in that brief silence, I understood something that changed everything. They hadn't stumbled across me. Someone had been helping them. Someone close enough to know exactly where I lived. And whoever that person was, they were still hiding. The following evening, the ballroom of the Riverside Heritage Hotel buzzed with conversation as community leaders, investors, contractors, and local families gathered for Brooks Restoration Group's annual housing charity fundraiser. For months, my team had planned the event to raise money for transitional housing projects. I had just finished thanking one of our sponsors when I noticed several heads turning toward the entrance. The room grew strangely quiet. Then I saw them. Harold and Elaine walked in together. Neither of them had been invited. Harold wore his only dark suit. Elaine carried the same faded family photograph from the day before. Before I could reach them, Harold raised his voice. There she is. Several guests smiled politely. A few even stepped aside so they could approach me. Harold wrapped an arm around my shoulder before I had the chance to move away. "Our daughter," he announced proudly. "We've always known she'd do great things." A ripple of warm congratulations spread through the crowd. "Congratulations," one investor said to Harold. "You must be incredibly proud." Harold nodded modestly. "We sacrificed everything to give her opportunities." I stood perfectly still. Every sentence sounded rehearsed. Elaine smiled sadly. "It wasn't easy raising someone so determined. We struggled for years, but seeing her success makes every hardship worth it." People around us responded exactly as they were meant to. Several guests smiled sympathetically. Someone even applauded. From a distance, they looked like loving parents celebrating their accomplished daughter. Only I knew that every word they spoke had been built on 22 years of silence. One of our longtime donors leaned toward me. "Daniella," she whispered, "you never mentioned your parents were coming." "They weren't invited," I replied quietly. Before she could ask another question, Harold lifted his glass. "I'd like to thank everyone here for supporting our daughter's remarkable company." He paused just long enough to draw more attention. "She learned resilience because her mother and I gave everything we had." My fingers tightened around my glass. Not because I wanted to interrupt him, because I knew exactly what would happen if I did. To everyone else, I would simply look like the ungrateful daughter embarrassing elderly parents. The lie worked because it was being performed in public. As I scanned the room, I noticed several familiar faces from the extended Brooks family. An older cousin approached cautiously. "Daniella." His expression was uncertain. "We always heard. You left your parents after you became successful." I stared at him. "What?" He looked embarrassed. "Your father said you cut them off once you made money." Another relative quietly joined the conversation. "We thought you wanted nothing to do with the family." Within seconds, the missing pieces began fitting together. For years, Harold and Elaine hadn't admitted abandoning me. They had rewritten the story. In their version, they were loving parents rejected by an ungrateful daughter who forgot where she came from. The lie hadn't just protected their reputation. It had followed me for decades. A member of my board stepped beside me. His voice remained calm, but his concern was obvious. "Daniella." I met his eyes. "Is there anything here the board needs to know?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a fair question. Our company's reputation depended on trust. Family scandals, real or imagined, could affect investors, donors, and community partnerships. I took a slow breath. "There is." His expression hardened. "You should know. I can prove every word they're saying is false." He studied me for a moment before nodding once. "I'll trust you." That single sentence reminded me something important. Unlike my parents, he was willing to wait for facts. I walked a few steps away from the crowd and called my attorney. When she answered, I spoke quietly. "I need every record from my surrender case." "You've decided?" "Yes." "The sealed files." "Everything, court records, agency reports, adoption records, every document that still exists." There was a brief pause. "I'll file the emergency requests tonight." After ending the call, I watched Harold laughing with strangers who believed every word he'd said. He had controlled the story for 22 years. Now I intended to replace stories with evidence. Late that evening, after the guests had gone home and the ballroom lights were being switched off, my phone rang. It was my attorney. Her voice sounded different. "Daniella." "What is it?" "The court-approved access." My heartbeat quickened. One of the sealed files has finally been released. The next morning, I sat alone in my office before sunrise. The city outside was still quiet. A thick envelope rested on my desk. Across the front were words I had waited 22 years to see. "Court-authorized release." For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I broke the seal. Inside were copies of reports, evaluations, handwritten notes, and official correspondence from the county child welfare office. Not opinions. Not memories. Facts. The first report was written less than a week after I entered state care. I read every line slowly. Child presence as polite, cooperative, and emotionally withdrawn. No signs of aggressive behavior. Expresses repeated belief that she is responsible for family misfortune. I stopped reading. That sentence hit harder than anything my parents had said on my porch. Someone had noticed. Someone had written down exactly what had been done to me. The next report came from a child psychologist. Patient demonstrates inappropriate self-blame, consistent with prolonged emotional abuse. There it was. Not bad luck. Not difficult child. Not behavioral problems. Emotional abuse. Officially documented. I continued turning pages. Every evaluation described nearly the same little girl. Quiet. Respectful. Anxious. Terrified of disappointing adults. Not one report suggested I was dangerous. Not one supported the story Harold and Elaine had repeated for decades. Instead, the files described neglect inside the home. A social worker's summary listed missed medical appointments, inconsistent school attendance, and repeated concerns about the emotional environment I had been living in. Everything my parents had blamed on me had been observed from the opposite direction. They had not been protecting themselves from a troubled child. The system had been trying to protect a child from them. Near the back of the file was another section. Financial disclosures. My attorney had highlighted several pages. I opened them carefully. Bank statements. Debt notices. Collection letters. Loan defaults. Each document carried dates from the same year I was abandoned. One creditor's notice demanded immediate payment after thousands of dollars disappeared through gambling losses. Another referenced multiple unpaid personal loans. Harold hadn't lost everything because I was bad luck. He had buried the family in debt. As I kept reading, another folder slipped from the envelope. Family contact attempts. I opened it. The first letter came from my assigned social worker 6 months after I entered foster care. It invited my parents to attend counseling and begin supervised reunification. Across the bottom was Harold's signed refusal. Another letter arrived the following year. Again they declined. A third. A fourth. Every opportunity had been offered. Every opportunity had been rejected. No scheduling conflicts. No misunderstandings. No lost paperwork. They chose not to come. 22 years of silence had not happened by accident. It had been renewed over and over again by deliberate decisions. I leaned back in my chair. For the first time, I understood why they had never searched for me. Finding me would have meant answering questions. Questions they could never afford. My attorney knocked lightly before stepping inside. I thought you'd want these too. She placed another folder on my desk. Inside were copies of written statements from relatives collected during the original investigation. I recognized several names immediately. Aunts, uncles, cousins. Many had repeated exactly what Harold and Elaine told them. That I was violent. That I constantly caused problems. That removing me protected the family. They hadn't invented those stories themselves. They had believed what they were told. The lie hadn't spread by accident. It had been carefully planted. I closed the file. They never stopped telling it, I said quietly. My attorney nodded. It became the family's version of history. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she slid one last document toward me. We're meeting everyone on Saturday. I nodded. They're expecting another demand for money. She gave a faint smile. And instead, I looked at the stack of verified records covering my desk. Instead, they're getting the truth. For the next 2 days, we organized every document in chronological order. Court records, financial statements, psychological evaluations, social worker reports. Copies were made for every family member attending the meeting. No opinions, no speeches, just evidence. Saturday afternoon, Harold had already gathered nearly everyone in my aunt's dining room before I arrived. The moment I stepped inside, he spread his hands dramatically. There she is. He turned toward the family. I've told Daniella she has a responsibility to help us now. Several relatives watched silently. Others looked uncomfortable. I carried a single leather folder beneath my arm. Harold continued speaking. We're not asking for much after everything we've done for. Without interrupting him, I walked to the center of the table. Then I placed the thick folder down. The sound echoed through the room. Every conversation stopped. No one reached for a chair. No one spoke. Every pair of eyes shifted from Harold to the documents lying between us. No one moved. The thick folder sat in the middle of the dining table like it had its own weight beyond paper. Harold looked at it, then back at me. What is this supposed to be? He asked. The truth, I replied. He gave a short laugh. We're here to discuss helping your parents, not dig up old history. The history is exactly why we're here. I opened the folder and removed the first document. This is the original report from the county social worker assigned to my case. I slid copies around the table. Every relative received one. No one spoke as pages began turning. Harold's confidence faded just enough for me to notice. I continued calmly. Please read the highlighted sections. The silence that followed was broken only by paper rustling. My aunt frowned. My cousin leaned closer to the page. Finally, Uncle Robert looked up. It says Daniella was cooperative. He looked back down, and that there were repeated concerns about neglect in the home. Harold immediately pointed across the table. Those people didn't know what they were talking about. I picked up the next document. This is the psychologist's evaluation. Again, copies moved across the table. Elaine shifted nervously in her chair. Her hands tightened around her purse. My aunt quietly read aloud. Patient demonstrates prolonged emotional abuse through repeated blame for family misfortunes. The room became even quieter. No one looked at me. They were all looking at Harold and Elaine. Harold forced a smile. Those psychologists write whatever they want. I reached for another stack. Then, let's look at financial records. His expression changed instantly. The confidence disappeared. I laid the debt notices beside the previous reports. These are bank records from the same year I entered foster care. My attorney, seated beside me, spoke for the first time. They were obtained through official court authorization. No one questioned their authenticity. My cousin slowly turned another page. There are gambling debts. Another relative added quietly. And multiple default notices. Uncle Robert looked directly at Harold. You told everyone you lost your job because your daughter brought bad luck. Harold swallowed. I had a difficult time. No, I answered. You had gambling debts. I placed the final folder on the table. This one matters most. Across the front were 4 simple words. Family contact attempts. Elaine stared at the cover before I even opened it. I could see recognition in her eyes. She already knew what was inside. I handed out the final copies. These are letters from my social workers. My aunt read silently for several moments before stopping. Her face changed. They invited you to reunification counseling. She turned another page. You declined. Another page. You declined again. Another. And again. My cousin looked at Elaine in disbelief. You told us they never let you see Daniella. Elaine's lips trembled. There was no explanation waiting. Only silence. Harold finally slammed his hand against the table. We did what we thought was best. For who? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. I looked around the room. For me. No response. For the family. Still nothing. For your reputation. His eyes dropped to the table. That answered the question better than words ever could. My aunt slowly removed her glasses. For years, she had sent birthday cards to Harold and Elaine, believing they were grieving parents rejected by an ungrateful daughter. Now she understood. We judged the wrong child, she whispered. She turned toward me. I'm so sorry. One by one, other relatives began speaking. We believed them. We should have asked questions. We failed you. No apology could return the years I lost. But hearing the truth spoken aloud lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. Elaine suddenly began crying. Not quietly. Not dramatically. Just the exhausted tears of someone watching decades of lies collapse in a single afternoon. She looked toward me. Daniella. I waited. I'm sorry. It was the first apology I had ever heard from her. But it arrived only after every excuse had disappeared. I nodded once. I accept that you said it. She blinked. But it doesn't erase what happened. Harold pushed back his chair. So that's it. His voice had lost every trace of authority. You'll just leave your parents with nothing. I met his eyes calmly. When I was 10 years old, you left your daughter with nothing. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The meeting ended without another argument. Relatives who had planned to help Harold and Elaine financially quietly withdrew their offers. No one wanted to fund a lie they had finally seen exposed. Within weeks, word spread through the extended family. Not as gossip, as fact. The official records spoke for themselves. My company's board thanked me for addressing the situation transparently. The charity partners who had attended the fundraiser reached out with messages of support rather than doubt. The truth protected everything the lies had threatened. A month later, I met with my attorney one final time. We updated every estate document and business record to ensure Harold and Elaine would have no legal claim to anything I had built. When the paperwork was complete, I signed without hesitation. Then I made one more decision. Our foundation created a scholarship and transition fund for young adults leaving foster care. I wanted children who felt abandoned to know that someone believed in their future. Every year, another young person would receive the opportunity I had spent years creating for myself. My past would no longer be defined by what had been taken. It would be measured by what I chose to give. That evening, I returned home. The house was quiet, peaceful, exactly the way I had built it. As I locked the front door, I thought about the frightened little girl who once believed she carried bad luck wherever she went. She had been wrong. The bad luck had never been her. It had been the people who refused to love her. I switched off the porch light, smiled to myself, and whispered the words I wished that 10-year-old could have heard all those years ago. You stopped being my family the day you abandoned me. Everything I've built since then belongs to the people who never walked away.